The richest room in Manhattan wasn't destroyed by a scandal. It was undone by a single laugh. I never imagined the worst night of my life would begin beneath a ceiling covered in crystal chandeliers worth more than every apartment I had ever rented combined. The elevator doors opened onto the top floor, and for one impossible second I forgot to breathe. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the penthouse like glass walls overlooking the endless lights of Manhattan, each building glowing against the deep blue evening sky as if the entire city had dressed for the occasion. Soft piano music drifted through the room while servers in crisp white jackets moved between guests carrying silver trays filled with sparkling drinks. Women wore gowns that shimmered like flowing rivers of light. Men laughed behind tailored suits that probably cost more than my student loans. Everyone looked as though they belonged there. Everyone except me. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 27 years old, and I had spent the last 6 years convincing myself that hard work could open doors money never could. As assistant curator for the Whitmore Gallery, I had been invited to oversee several rare paintings being auctioned during one of the city's most exclusive charity events. It should have been the biggest opportunity of my career. Instead, it felt like walking into a room where every person had already decided I didn't belong. I checked the small silver watch my father had left me before he passed away. It wasn't expensive. The leather strap had faded from years of wear, but it always reminded me that dignity didn't have a price tag. I whispered those words to myself as I stepped farther inside. Dignity doesn't need permission. For a while, everything went smoothly. Guests admired the artwork. Wealthy donors exchanged polished conversations about investments, vacation homes, and private collections. I answered questions about the paintings with the confidence that came from years of studying artists whose names most people only pretended to recognize. Then it happened. A man wearing a navy tuxedo stopped in front of one of the gallery labels and frowned. "You're the curator?" he asked, looking at my simple black dress before looking back at my face. "Assistant curator," I answered politely. He smiled, but it wasn't kindness. "Interesting. They really are letting anyone into penthouses these days." The people standing nearby chuckled. Someone else muttered, "Maybe next year they'll let the valet bid on the artwork too." More laughter followed. It spread across the room like dominoes falling one after another. I felt every pair of eyes drift toward me. My cheeks grew warm, but I refused to lower my head. If I looked away, they would remember me as embarrassed. If I stood tall, maybe I would remember myself differently. I forced a calm smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "The paintings don't seem to mind where I came from," I said quietly. A few smiles disappeared, but another voice answered from somewhere behind the crowd. "Neither do we. We just find it entertaining." This time the laughter was louder. It echoed beneath the crystal ceiling until it seemed the penthouse itself had joined in, and in that moment I realized something far more unsettling than being mocked. Across the room, near the windows overlooking the city, one man wasn't laughing at all. He simply watched. Completely still. As though the evening had finally become interesting. I could not explain why that stranger near the windows unsettled me more than the people laughing only a few feet away. Maybe it was because everyone else seemed eager to be noticed while he appeared perfectly comfortable becoming invisible. He stood with one hand resting lightly against the crystal railing, looking out across the city instead of joining the conversation swirling around him. His charcoal suit fit with effortless precision, and the soft glow from the skyline reflected across his dark hair without revealing much of his expression. No expensive watch flashed beneath the lights. No oversized smile searched for attention. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to prove anything to anyone. I forced myself to look away. Staring would only make me seem more uncomfortable than I already felt. Besides, I still had a job to do. The next painting was scheduled to be unveiled in less than 10 minutes, and the event coordinator was already signaling for me from across the ballroom. I inhaled slowly, smoothed the sleeve of my black dress, and reminded myself that embarrassment was temporary. Professionalism lasted longer. As I crossed the room, snippets of conversation floated past me. Someone complimented the imported marble flooring. Another guest debated whether a vacation home in Aspen was a better investment than another one in Napa Valley. A woman wearing a diamond necklace casually mentioned spending $70,000 on a handbag because the waiting list had been too long. Their world felt so distant from mine that it might as well have existed on another planet. My father used to tell me that wealth was loud when it was insecure and quiet when it was earned. Standing in that penthouse, I wondered if he had been right all along. The coordinator handed me a tablet containing the auction schedule. Her smile looked strained. "Do not let them get under your skin," she whispered. "Some of our donors enjoy testing people." I nodded even though my stomach tightened. Testing people. It sounded kinder than humiliation, but it felt exactly the same. Before I could respond, a server accidentally brushed against my shoulder while passing with a tray of sparkling water. One glass tipped sideways. I caught it before it fell, managing to save every drop from spilling onto a guest's designer jacket. "Nice reflexes," an older gentleman said with an approving smile. "You must have waited tables before working in art." Several people nearby laughed again. This time the sound was softer, but somehow it cut deeper. I simply smiled. "Actually, I did," I answered. "It helped pay for college." The gentleman blinked, clearly surprised that I had not taken offense. "Nothing wrong with honest work," I added. His smile faded first. Then another guest looked down at the floor instead of at me. For the first time that evening, the laughter did not spread. It stopped almost as quickly as it had begun. That was when I noticed movement reflected in the glass windows. The silent man had turned away from the skyline. His eyes settled on the small circle surrounding me with calm, unwavering focus. Nobody introduced him. Nobody called his name. Yet something changed the instant he started walking. Conversations dissolved into whispers. Smiles disappeared. Even the musicians seemed to lower their volume without realizing they had done it. I did not know who he was, but every step he took toward the center of the ballroom made the air feel impossibly still. The room reacted to him before I did. I had spent years studying paintings that captured invisible things like authority, grief, and hope with nothing more than color and light. Whatever surrounded this man belonged in one of those paintings because it could not be measured, yet everyone seemed to feel it at exactly the same moment. Conversations faded into polite murmurs. A senator who had been speaking confidently seconds earlier suddenly paused in the middle of his sentence. Two executives quietly stepped aside without being asked. Even the event coordinator, who had been calmly managing every detail of the evening, straightened her posture as though preparing for an unexpected inspection. I watched him approach with slow, unhurried steps. He did not smile. He did not rush. He simply moved with complete certainty that the space ahead of him would always be clear. He stopped a few feet from the painting I had been preparing to present. His attention rested on the canvas first, studying every brushstroke before his eyes shifted toward me. They were a deep gray that reflected the city lights without revealing what he was thinking. "You are the curator?" he asked in a calm voice. "Assistant curator," I answered. "My name is Claire Bennett." He gave a slight nod, acknowledging my introduction without offering one of his own. Before another word could be spoken, the same man in the navy tuxedo who had mocked me earlier returned with a crystal glass in his hand and an audience close behind him. "Claire was just entertaining us," he announced loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "She believes knowledge matters more than pedigree." A few people laughed again, although this time the laughter sounded uncertain. "I actually believe character matters more than either," I replied before I could stop myself. Silence followed for nearly 3 seconds. Long enough for everyone to realize I had answered without raising my voice. The man chuckled as though I had confirmed his point. "That is exactly the kind of thing people say when they have never belonged in rooms like this." I felt my heartbeat quicken, but I refused to look away. "Perhaps," I said quietly. "Or maybe it is something people learn after discovering that every room eventually becomes ordinary." Someone nearby inhaled sharply. The navy tuxedo man forced another smile. Tell me, Miss Bennet. Do you always lecture the people who make donations large enough to keep your gallery open? His words were polished, almost friendly, but every syllable carried the same message. Know your place. Before I could answer, the silent man finally spoke again. Interesting question. His voice was low, controlled, and impossible to ignore. Every face turned toward him. I have one of my own. He looked directly at the navy tuxedo man. Why does confidence make you so uncomfortable? No one laughed. The silence that followed felt heavier than all the music that had filled the penthouse earlier. The donor blinked, searching for a response that never seemed to arrive. For the first time that evening, I saw uncertainty replace arrogance. The stranger never raised his voice. He never changed his expression. Yet somehow the balance of the entire room shifted with a single sentence, and I realized I was no longer the person everyone had been watching. They were all watching him. The man in the navy tuxedo opened his mouth twice before any words came out. Around us, crystal glasses remained suspended halfway to waiting lips, forgotten as every guest watched the exchange unfold. He forced a laugh that sounded thinner than before. You misunderstand me, he said, straightening his jacket with practiced confidence. We were simply enjoying a little conversation. Nobody intended any offense. The stranger studied him for another moment without speaking. It was remarkable how silence could become heavier than accusation. Finally, he gave a small nod that revealed nothing. I see. That was all he said. No lecture. No dramatic declaration. Just two quiet words before he stepped aside and turned his attention back toward the painting hanging beneath the gallery lights. The tension eased almost immediately. Conversations resumed, although noticeably softer than before. The musicians continued their gentle melody. Servers resumed weaving through the crowd with polished professionalism. Yet something fundamental had changed. The easy confidence that had filled the penthouse earlier never fully returned. People glanced toward the stranger before speaking, almost unconsciously measuring every sentence. I exhaled slowly, only then realizing I had been holding my breath. Miss Bennet, the event coordinator whispered as she approached me. The unveiling begins in 3 minutes. I nodded, grateful for something familiar to focus on. Work had always been my safest place. Paintings did not judge the people who admired them. They simply waited for someone willing to look closely enough. I stepped onto the small presentation platform beside the featured artwork. The spotlight warmed my face while dozens of guests gradually gathered in front of me. Their expressions varied from curiosity to polite impatience. I recognized several museum trustees, a well-known architect, 2 television personalities, and at least one billionaire whose face appeared regularly in business magazines. Near the back of the audience, the stranger remained perfectly still, watching without interruption. I introduced the artist, explained the historical significance of the collection, and described how every layer of paint reflected a different stage of the painter's life. As I spoke, my nervousness slowly disappeared. This was the language I understood. Color, history, restoration, memory. For several minutes, nobody interrupted. Then a familiar voice cut through the room once again. Amazing, the man in the navy tuxedo said loudly. She talks about paintings like they are people. A few uncertain chuckles drifted through the audience. He smiled wider, encouraged by the reaction. Perhaps that is because paintings cannot question her credentials. This time, however, the laughter did not spread across the ballroom. Only a handful of guests joined in before falling silent. Others shifted uncomfortably. A woman lowered her eyes toward the floor. An elderly collector slowly shook his head. The atmosphere no longer welcomed easy ridicule. I rested one hand lightly against the wooden podium and answered as calmly as I could. Art has survived wars, disasters, recessions, and centuries of changing opinions. It teaches humility better than any classroom ever could. Nobody responded immediately. The room settled into another long silence. Then, from somewhere near the back, came the quiet sound of a single pair of hands beginning to applaud. Every head turned. The stranger had not moved from his place near the windows, but his measured applause echoed clearly beneath the chandeliers. One clap became another. Then another. Within seconds, more guests slowly joined him, until the applause filled the penthouse with a sound completely different from the laughter that had greeted me earlier. I looked toward him in disbelief, but he was no longer watching the crowd. He was watching me, as though waiting to see what I would do next. The applause faded slowly, but the feeling it left behind lingered in the air like the final note of a beautiful song. I stepped down from the platform with my pulse still racing, unsure whether I should feel relieved or even more unsettled. The evening had shifted in ways I could not explain. Moments earlier I had been the easiest target in the room. Now the same people who had laughed at me avoided meeting my eyes. They suddenly found remarkable interest in their champagne glasses, their phones, or the skyline beyond the windows. It was as though the invisible rules inside the penthouse had changed without anyone announcing them. I thanked several guests who complimented the exhibition, accepting their kind words with cautious gratitude. Compliments that arrived only after public approval always carried a strange weight. They sounded sincere, yet I wondered how many would have been spoken if that quiet stranger had never applauded. The thought stayed with me as I organized my notes beside the display. Miss Bennett. I turned to find the event coordinator smiling with obvious relief. The chairman would like to thank you personally after the auction. Several donors have already increased their pledges. That is wonderful news, I answered honestly. Supporting the gallery mattered far more than my pride ever could. Before she could continue, two men in tailored black suits entered the ballroom through a private hallway. They were not security in the ordinary sense. They carried themselves with calm discipline, scanning the room without appearing threatening. One paused beside the stranger near the windows and leaned down just enough to speak quietly into his ear. The stranger listened without interrupting. Then he gave a slight nod. Nothing about the exchange seemed dramatic, yet I noticed something remarkable. The chairman of the charity event, a man whose name appeared regularly on national business networks, waited patiently several feet away instead of approaching. He was waiting for the stranger to finish. My curiosity grew stronger. Who was important enough to make powerful people wait without a single complaint? I picked up a catalog from the registration table, pretending to review the auction schedule while discreetly searching the guest list. Hundreds of names filled the glossy pages. Museum patrons, philanthropists, technology founders, senators, athletes, actors. I reached the final page without finding the face that now occupied every corner of my thoughts. Looking for someone? An elderly woman beside me asked with a warm smile. Actually, yes, I admitted. The gentleman near the windows. I do not believe I caught his name. Her expression changed almost instantly. Not fear. Respect. The kind reserved for people whose reputation arrived before they did. She lowered her voice. Most people here already know it. I waited, but she simply smiled again and walked away before saying another word. My eyes drifted back across the ballroom. At that exact moment the stranger finally looked in my direction. For the briefest second our eyes met. There was no arrogance in his expression. No expectation that I should thank him for speaking earlier. If anything, he looked as though he had quietly solved a small inconvenience and already moved on. Then, without warning, he started walking toward me. Every conversation along his path dissolved into silence once more. Guests instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path across the marble floor. Nobody introduced him. Nobody announced his arrival. They simply moved. As he stopped a few feet away, I realized I still did not know his name, but somehow everyone else already understood exactly who stood before me. He stopped close enough that I could finally see the details everyone else seemed too careful to notice. A faint silver streak touched the edge of his dark hair near one temple. His tie was perfectly straight, but there was nothing flashy about it. No oversized watch. No designer logo demanding attention. Everything about him suggested someone who had reached a place where wealth no longer needed to introduce itself. He looked at me for several quiet seconds before speaking. "Your presentation was excellent." His voice remained calm, almost conversational, as though the room full of powerful people had disappeared. "Thank you," I replied. "That means a great deal." He tilted his head slightly. "Does it?" The unexpected question caught me off guard. "You do not know who I am." I smiled politely. "No, I do not. But I appreciate genuine compliments no matter who they come from." Something almost resembling amusement appeared in his eyes before fading again. "That is a rare answer." Before I could respond, footsteps approached behind us. The chairman of the charity gala arrived wearing the practiced smile of someone accustomed to managing influential personalities. "Mr. Romano," he said warmly. "I hope everything has met your expectations this evening." Romano. The name settled into my thoughts, but it still meant nothing to me. The stranger acknowledged him with a brief nod. "Your gallery representative handled herself well." The chairman laughed nervously. "Claire has exceeded every expectation. We are fortunate to have her." It was strange hearing such confidence from the same people who had quietly watched me become the evening's entertainment less than an hour earlier. Damian Romano looked toward the chairman without changing his expression. "Good." Just one word. Yet the chairman seemed visibly relieved by it. "If you will excuse me," the chairman said, "the auction begins shortly." As soon as he walked away, the silence returned between us. I finally gathered enough courage to ask the question that had been building inside me all evening. "Should I know your name?" He studied me carefully before answering. "Probably not." "That is an unusual answer. It keeps life simpler." I almost laughed. "Judging by the way everyone reacts when you enter a room, I am not sure your life is simple at all." For the first time that evening, the corner of his mouth lifted into the faintest smile. It was brief enough that I almost believed I had imagined it. "Appearances are often expensive," he said quietly. "Truth usually costs more." Before I could think of a reply, the man in the navy tuxedo appeared again, this time accompanied by two other donors. His confidence had returned, although it looked forced. "Mr. Romano," he said enthusiastically. "I was hoping we might discuss the waterfront development next week." Damian turned toward him with the same composed expression he had shown everyone else. "Perhaps." The donor continued speaking anyway, filling the silence with compliments and business proposals that sounded carefully rehearsed. Damian listened for less than 10 seconds before raising one hand ever so slightly. The man stopped immediately. "Before we discuss investments," Damian said, "I have a question." The ballroom seemed to grow still again. Nearby conversations faded. Even guests standing across the room glanced in our direction as though they sensed something important was about to happen. Damian's gray eyes never left the donor's face. His voice remained perfectly even. Why was Miss Bennet the only person expected to earn respect after she entered this room, while everyone else assumed they already deserved it? No one answered. The silence that followed felt longer than any speech I had heard that night, and for the first time I realized the auction was no longer the most important event happening inside the penthouse. The silence stretched until it became almost tangible. No one hurried to answer Damian Romano's question. The man in the navy tuxedo glanced around as though searching for someone willing to rescue him, but every familiar face suddenly seemed fascinated by anything except the conversation unfolding in front of him. A waiter carefully adjusted a tray that did not need adjusting. A couple turned toward the skyline without saying a word. Even the musicians allowed the final note of their melody to fade before beginning another piece. I felt every eye shifting between Damian and me, and the attention made my chest tighten. This was never what I wanted. I had come to protect paintings, not become the center of an invisible battle over pride and status. Before anyone else could speak, I stepped forward. "Mr. Romano," I said gently, "it is all right." His eyes moved from the donor back to mine. They were calm, unreadable, but completely focused. Is it? He asked. I nodded. People make quick judgments. Sometimes they regret them later. I do not need anyone punished for that. The words surprised even me. Perhaps I should have welcomed someone standing beside me after such an uncomfortable evening, yet something inside me refused to let another person fight my battles. My father had taught me that dignity meant standing on my own feet even when they trembled. Damien studied my expression for several quiet seconds before answering. You believe kindness changes people. Sometimes it does, I replied. Sometimes embarrassment teaches more than anger ever could. The donor finally found his voice. Miss Bennet, if anything I said was misunderstood, then perhaps I could. He stopped speaking because Damien had looked at him again. There was nothing threatening in that glance. It simply demanded honesty. The donor cleared his throat. Perhaps I could have handled myself better. It was not quite an apology. It was not quite an excuse either. It floated awkwardly somewhere between the two. I smiled politely. Thank you. Damien remained silent, but I sensed he was measuring every word spoken around him. Not judging. Observing. Like someone assembling pieces of a puzzle that everyone else believed had already been completed. The auction host announced that bidding would begin in 5 minutes, and the crowd slowly drifted toward the center of the ballroom. Conversations restarted, though noticeably quieter than before. As guests found their seats, I began collecting my presentation notes. Damien did not move. You should not have defended them, he said quietly once we were alone again. I looked up. Maybe not. But I was defending myself too. He waited. If I allow other people's mistakes to decide who I become, then they win twice. Something shifted behind his steady expression. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. As though my answer reminded him of someone he had once known or perhaps someone he had once been. Most people ask powerful strangers for favors, he said. You asked me to let something go. I folded my notes carefully before answering. Respect that is forced rarely lasts. Respect that is chosen stays much longer. For the first time all evening, Damien looked away before I did. His gaze settled on the glittering Manhattan skyline beyond the glass walls. Thousands of lights stretched toward the horizon, each one belonging to a different story. You may be right, he said almost to himself. Or you may be the first person in a very long time willing to prove me wrong. At that exact moment, one of the men in the tailored black suits approached quietly and handed Damien a small envelope. He opened it, read the single card inside, and his expression became perfectly still again. Then he slipped the card into his jacket pocket, looked toward the auction stage, and said only 4 words that made the room suddenly feel different once again. Interesting. Now I understand. The ballroom transformed with remarkable efficiency. Velvet ropes guided guests toward rows of elegant chairs facing the illuminated auction stage while attendants collected the final glasses of champagne. The gentle music faded into quiet anticipation, replaced by the soft rustle of expensive fabrics and whispered conversations. I moved toward the side of the stage where the gallery staff coordinated the order of the paintings, grateful for the familiar routine. Art followed careful preparation. It never relied on luck. As I checked the catalog one last time, I noticed something unusual. Damien Romano had not taken one of the reserved front row seats prepared for the evening's principal benefactors. Instead, he remained standing near the back of the room with the 2 men who had quietly joined him earlier. They spoke only briefly before one disappeared through a discreet service hallway. Nothing about their movements attracted attention, yet they carried the quiet precision of people accustomed to solving problems before anyone else realized they existed. I reminded myself that it was none of my business. Whoever Damien Romano truly was, tonight was about preserving the success of the auction, not satisfying my curiosity. The auctioneer welcomed everyone with polished enthusiasm, thanking donors for their generosity and explaining how the proceeds would support educational programs throughout New York City. Applause followed. The first painting sold quickly, then the second, then the third. Paddle numbers lifted with graceful confidence while bids climbed by tens of thousands of dollars at a time. The room slowly relaxed again, comforted by familiar displays of wealth and prestige. Between presentations, I stepped behind the stage to retrieve the documentation for the next collection. That was when I heard two voices drifting through the partially open service corridor. I recognized one immediately. The man in the navy tuxedo. "She was supposed to lose her composure," he muttered with unmistakable frustration. "One embarrassing moment and the board would have questioned whether she belonged here." Another voice answered quietly. Instead, Romano noticed. He was never supposed to notice. "We checked the guest confirmations this morning. His attendance was not listed." My hand froze around the folder I was carrying. I had not intended to overhear anything, but their words rooted me in place. "What do we do now?" the second man asked. "Nothing tonight," the donor replied. "We wait. The gallery board only needs one excuse to replace her." We simply underestimated how quickly public sympathy changes when the right person decides to pay attention. Their footsteps faded down the hallway before I could move again. My pulse echoed loudly in my ears. This had not been casual teasing. It had been planned. Every sarcastic comment. Every carefully timed joke. Every attempt to make me appear small in front of the gallery's most influential supporters. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. For months I had questioned whether I truly deserved my position. Now I wondered how many invisible obstacles had been placed in my path before I ever entered the penthouse. "Miss Bennet." I turned quickly. Damien stood several feet away in the corridor, his expression as composed as ever. I had no idea how long he had been there. His eyes shifted briefly toward the hallway where the two men had disappeared before returning to me. "You heard enough," he said quietly. It was not a question. I swallowed and nodded. I thought I had failed tonight. He looked at me with calm certainty. "No. Someone invested considerable effort trying to make sure you believed that." Before I could respond, one of his associates approached and handed him a small tablet. Damien glanced at the screen for only a few seconds before locking it again. His gaze remained steady. "The auction is about to become much more honest than its organizers expected." When we returned to the ballroom, nothing on the surface had changed. The auctioneer still smiled beneath the warm lights. Collectors still raised polished wooden paddles with effortless confidence. Crystal chandeliers continued scattering reflections across the marble floor. Anyone walking into the room would have believed they were witnessing another perfect evening among New York City's elite. Only I knew that beneath the expensive suits and practiced smiles, something had already cracked. Damien Romano walked beside me without saying another word. He did not hurry. He did not interrupt the auction. He simply waited. Somehow that patience unsettled me more than any dramatic confrontation could have. The next painting sold for $480,000. Applause echoed politely through the room. The auctioneer prepared to introduce the evening's featured collection when one of the event technicians quietly approached the stage and whispered into his ear. The auctioneer looked briefly confused before nodding and stepping away from the microphone. A large display screen behind the stage, originally prepared to show artwork details, flickered once before changing to a security camera recording. Murmurs spread across the ballroom. I recognized the hallway immediately. It was the same corridor where I had overheard the conversation only minutes earlier. The recording showed the man in the navy tuxedo speaking with his associate. There was no dramatic music. No hidden editing. Only clear audio and an ordinary surveillance angle capturing every carefully chosen word. She was supposed to lose her composure. Several guests exchanged startled looks. The recording continued. One embarrassing moment and the board would have questioned whether she belonged here. Someone in the front row slowly lowered his bidding paddle. Another donor removed his glasses and stared silently at the screen. The chairman's confident expression disappeared. No one interrupted the recording because no one could deny what they were hearing. The final sentence echoed through the ballroom with astonishing clarity. We simply underestimated how quickly public sympathy changes when the right person decides to pay attention. Silence followed. Not polite silence. Honest silence. The kind that arrives when excuses finally run out. The donor stood abruptly. This is completely out of context, he insisted. Someone manipulated that recording. Before anyone answered, Damien stepped forward from the side of the ballroom. He did not approach the stage. He did not need to. Every person in the room instinctively turned toward him anyway. The recording has already been authenticated, he said calmly. 3 independent copies exist. Timestamps match the building security system. Nothing has been altered. His voice remained measured, almost gentle, yet every sentence carried absolute certainty. The chairman looked visibly shaken. Is that true? He asked the building manager. The manager swallowed before nodding. Yes. We verified everything moments ago. A quiet wave of disbelief passed through the audience. Several trustees exchanged uncomfortable glances. One elderly collector stood and walked directly toward me. Miss Bennet, he said sincerely, extending his hand, I owe you an apology. I allowed another person's confidence to influence my own judgment. That was unfair. His words opened a door that no one had expected. Another donor approached. Then another. Within minutes, people who had barely acknowledged my existence earlier were apologizing with genuine humility. No one was forced. No one was publicly humiliated. They simply recognized the truth after finally seeing it clearly. I looked toward Damien. He remained exactly where he had been, watching quietly without satisfaction or celebration. It was only then that I understood the difference between power and noise. The loudest person had not changed the room. The calmest one had. The auction resumed, but it no longer felt like the same evening. The conversations that returned carried a different tone, quieter and more thoughtful, as though everyone had suddenly remembered that reputation could change faster than the New York weather. The paintings were still extraordinary. The donations still climbed higher with every bid. Yet the true centerpiece of the night was no longer hanging on the walls. It was the invisible shift that had taken place inside every person who had witnessed the truth. I accepted each apology with the same simple answer. Thank you. Nothing more. There was no satisfaction in watching people feel embarrassed. If anything, I hoped they would remember the lesson longer than they remembered my name. While the final collection was being presented, I stepped onto the terrace for a moment of fresh air. The cool breeze drifting above Manhattan carried the distant sound of traffic nearly 80 stories below. Thousands of lights stretched toward the horizon like scattered stars resting on the earth instead of the sky. I wrapped my arms lightly around myself and finally allowed the tension to leave my shoulders. Most people would still be angry. Damien's voice came from behind me. I turned to find him standing several feet away, giving me enough space to decide whether I welcomed the conversation. Maybe, I answered. But carrying anger home would only make tonight last longer than it deserves. He looked across the skyline before speaking again. You surprised me. I smiled faintly. That seems to happen often tonight. Not because you stayed calm, he said. Because you chose grace after learning everything had been planned. His words lingered between us. I almost wished I had never overheard that conversation, I admitted. It is difficult to discover that strangers invested time trying to make you doubt yourself. He nodded once. Yes. There was something unusually personal in that single word. Not sympathy. Recognition. Has that happened to you? I asked before I could stop myself. He remained silent long enough that I wondered whether I had crossed a line. Finally he answered. People rarely attack what they fear. They usually attack what they cannot control. His gaze never left the city below. Eventually you stop asking why. For the first time that evening, I did not see the mysterious man who seemed capable of changing an entire room with a sentence. I saw someone carrying responsibilities heavy enough to reshape the way he looked at the world. Earlier, I said carefully, everyone acted as though they already knew you. I was the only one who did not. A faint smile crossed his face. You were also the only one who treated me exactly the same before and after learning my name. I laughed softly. That is because your name still does not explain who you are. He looked at me then, and something behind his calm expression softened almost imperceptibly. Perhaps that is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. The terrace doors opened quietly behind us. One of the men in the black suits approached with respectful patience. Mr. Romano, he said. The board would like a private meeting before the evening ends. Damien acknowledged him with a slight nod but did not leave immediately. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a simple white business card. There was no gold lettering. No impressive title. Only his name and a phone number. He offered it to me without ceremony. If anyone ever makes you question whether you earned your place, he said quietly, call me after you remind yourself that they are wrong. I prefer to be the second person who believes in you, not the first. For a long moment I simply looked at the card resting in my hand, realizing that the most powerful gesture of the evening had arrived without applause, without witnesses, and without asking for anything in return. When we walked back inside, the atmosphere had changed so completely that it almost felt like a different building. The conversations were quieter, but they carried something they had lacked earlier. Sincerity. People no longer spoke only to impress one another. They listened. They paused before choosing their words. It was remarkable how quickly humility could become fashionable once someone courageous enough had worn it first. Damien excused himself and followed the chairman toward a private conference room overlooking the east side of the city. I had no intention of following, but as members of the gallery staff prepared the final paperwork, fragments of the discussion drifted through the partially open doorway. The board agrees corrective action is necessary, one trustee said. Miss Bennett deserves a formal statement clearing her reputation. Another voice added, the donor responsible should lose his advisory position immediately. Before anyone else could continue, Damien spoke in the same calm voice I had heard throughout the evening. Removing a title is easy. The room fell silent. Changing character is more difficult. Someone cleared his throat. Then what would you recommend? There was a brief pause before Damien answered. Begin with honesty. Publish exactly what happened. Accept responsibility as an institution instead of blaming one individual. Require every senior member of the board to participate in the educational outreach program this auction supports. Let them spend time with the students whose futures they claim to protect. Perspective changes more people than punishment ever will. No one interrupted him. And the donor? Another trustee finally asked. Damien answered without hesitation. He should apologize publicly to Miss Bennett. Not because it repairs the past, but because it may influence the future. Pride spreads quickly in influential circles. Humility should spread just as fast. I remained completely still outside the room. His words surprised me more than anything else that had happened that evening. Until then I had quietly assumed a man capable of commanding such respect would solve problems through overwhelming influence alone. Instead, he was asking powerful people to become better versions of themselves rather than smaller versions of one another. A few minutes later the meeting ended. Trustees emerged one by one, their expressions thoughtful instead of defensive. The man in the navy tuxedo was waiting near the entrance, no longer surrounded by admirers. His confidence had disappeared beneath genuine uncertainty. When he saw me, he walked forward slowly. Miss Bennett, he said quietly. I owe you more than the apology I offered earlier. Several nearby guests instinctively turned toward us, but nobody spoke. I judged you before I knew you, he continued. Then I encouraged others to do the same because I believed status gave me that right. I was wrong. His voice was steady, without excuses or theatrical regret. You carried yourself with more dignity tonight than I deserved. I looked at him for a moment before answering. Thank you for saying it directly. He nodded once. I hope one day I earn the chance to deserve that forgiveness. Then begin there, I replied. Not by convincing me. By becoming someone who would not make the same choice again. He accepted those words with a quiet nod before walking away alone. I noticed several trustees watching him, not with contempt but with expectation. They expected better now. That was the real consequence of truth. It raised the standard for everyone who witnessed it. Across the ballroom, Damien stood near the window speaking softly with the chairman. He never looked toward us while the apology unfolded. Somehow he already knew it would. For the first time that night, I realized his greatest strength was never making people fear him. It was making them expect more from themselves than they had expected only a few hours earlier. The final auction closed to generous applause as the last painting found its new home. The total displayed on the large screen exceeded every expectation the gallery had announced at the beginning of the evening, and for a few quiet moments everyone celebrated the success of the charity itself instead of the people standing inside the room. It felt fitting. Art had finally become the center of attention again. Staff members began carefully packing the remaining collections while guests gathered near the windows overlooking Manhattan one last time before leaving. I stood beside one of the paintings, completing the final condition report, when the chairman approached carrying a small velvet box. Claire, he said with a warm smile that felt genuine now, the board voted unanimously during the meeting. I looked up, confused. Voted on what? He handed me the box. Inside rested a simple silver pin bearing the gallery's crest. Nothing extravagant. Just elegant craftsmanship. Beginning next month, we would like you to become our senior curator. For a second I thought I had misunderstood him. I have only been the assistant curator. He nodded. Until tonight. Your knowledge earned that promotion long before this evening. We simply allowed other voices to delay what should have happened months ago. I carefully closed the box without speaking. The promotion mattered deeply, but not because of the title itself. It mattered because for the first time I knew I had not been chosen to satisfy appearances or politics. I had been chosen because someone finally looked at my work instead of my background. As the chairman walked away to greet departing donors, several members of the gallery staff surrounded me with congratulations. The same co-workers who had quietly worried about my future earlier now laughed with sincere happiness. It was not triumph that filled my heart. It was relief. Relief that hard work could still matter in a room where money often spoke first. Across the ballroom, Damien prepared to leave. His associates waited near the private elevator, giving him respectful distance while he finished speaking with several trustees. No cameras followed him. No reporters crowded around him. It struck me that the most influential man in the building seemed to spend the least amount of energy convincing anyone that he mattered. Before he reached the elevator, he glanced in my direction. I walked over before I could lose my courage. I wanted to thank you, I said. He looked at the silver gallery pin resting in my hand before meeting my eyes again. Do not thank me for something you earned yourself. I smiled. Then thank you for making sure people finally looked. He considered that answer for a moment before nodding once. Fair enough. The elevator doors opened quietly behind him, but neither of us moved immediately. Will I see you again? I asked without thinking. The question surprised me as much as it surprised him. A faint smile appeared, softer than any expression I had seen from him all evening. New York is smaller than people imagine, he said. Especially when two people value the same things. I laughed quietly. Art? Character, he answered. The single word settled gently into the silence between us. He stepped into the elevator, and the doors began to close. Just before they met, he gave me one final nod. Not a dramatic farewell. Not a promise. Simply the acknowledgement of someone who believed our paths had crossed for a reason. As the elevator disappeared from sight, I looked down at the business card still resting beside the silver pin in my hand. One represented the career I had spent years building. The other represented the unexpected reminder that sometimes the person who changes your life does not rescue you from failure. They simply refuse to let the world overlook the person you already are. The penthouse was almost empty when I finally walked toward the windows where the evening had quietly rewritten my life. The city below shimmered beneath the midnight sky, every street glowing like a thread woven into something far greater than any one person could ever control. Earlier that night those same lights had watched strangers laugh while I questioned whether I belonged. Now they reflected against the glass as if nothing had happened at all. That was the strange thing about New York. The skyline never changed because of one difficult evening, but the people standing beneath it sometimes did. I slipped the silver gallery pin into my jacket pocket beside Damian Romano's business card. They rested together without competing for space. One represented the career I had spent years earning through patience, late nights, and quiet determination. The other reminded me that even the strongest person occasionally needed someone willing to recognize the truth before everyone else did. I thought about my father and the countless evenings he had spent teaching me that character could never be borrowed from wealth or status. At the time those lessons had sounded simple, almost ordinary. Standing inside the most exclusive penthouse I had ever entered, I finally understood how rare they truly were. Behind me, the last members of the gallery staff switched off the exhibition lights one section at a time. Paintings disappeared into carefully padded crates, protected for their next journey. The chandeliers dimmed gradually until only the soft glow from Manhattan remained. The room that had echoed with laughter only hours earlier now rested in complete silence. Not an uncomfortable silence. A peaceful one. The kind that follows when nothing dishonest remains to be said. As I walked toward the elevator, the elderly collector who had first apologized to me caught up beside me. "Miss Bennett," he said warmly, "I have attended charity auctions for nearly 30 years. I smiled. "Then you have probably seen everything." He shook his head. "No. Tonight I saw something for the first time." I waited. I watched influence protect dignity instead of ego. He extended his hand once more. "I hope our paths cross again." "I hope so too," I answered. The elevator carried me quietly down through the sleeping building. Floor after floor disappeared above me until the lobby doors opened and the cool night air welcomed me outside. The sounds of the city surrounded me once again. Taxi horns echoed in the distance. A subway rumbled beneath the streets. Someone laughed from a nearby sidewalk cafe. Life had already continued without asking permission from anyone inside the penthouse. I stood there for a moment before looking once more at the simple white business card in my hand. I did not know when I would see Damian again. Maybe next week. Maybe next year. Maybe never. Somehow that uncertainty did not trouble me. Some people enter your life to stay. Others arrive to remind you of something you were beginning to forget. Damian had reminded me that respect could not be purchased, borrowed, inherited, or demanded. It could only be earned, protected, and freely given. I slipped the card safely into my wallet and started walking toward the subway instead of searching for a limousine or a private car. The city looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but I no longer saw it through the same eyes. I had entered the penthouse believing the wealthiest people owned the room. I left understanding that the room had belonged to the person who valued human dignity the most. Money had built the walls. Reputation had filled them. But character was the only thing that remained after everyone finally went home.